we are actually going to be configuring a workflow. This is the user experience the user has while onboarding their device. So you see we've already logged into Cloupath here, as we demoed earlier in an earlier module or earlier lab. And now we're going to go into the configuration portion. So you're going to click on the configuration, and then we're going to go to workflows. Workflows is the workhorse of Cloupath. In this case, you can see we have no workflows configured yet, so we're going to configure one for the first time. So we're going to click on Create Workflow. And at that point, it's going to ask you to name that workflow. In this case, I'm just going to call it James Workflow. Now, this is a naming or a display name of it, but down at the bottom is actually the URL name. And so this needs to be a URL sensitive or URL proven name that we can create here, and this is going to be the actual URL that all the workflow that I'm configuring now is going to be placed under, meaning that once I have published this or once this has gone out, any devices that need to be onboarded are going to actually use this URL name, and we will see the more details later about that. But do know in this case I'm just going to put simple James-workflow. Once I've done that and I push save now, you can make sure that have include demo data unchecked unless you want to have that. And if you're practicing or if you want to get some experience, you can click on that and it'll automatically populate. You'll see in a minute that we'll actually use that for or actually later on we'll actually see where we use that, and you can see what all populates there. It's just simply a way for it to automatically kind of create a basic workflow for you to be able to examine or be able to manipulate if you so choose. We're going to click save here. And at that point, you can now see we have a workflow listed here. It is, of course, unpublished because we just created it. And then here's the URL for that particular workflow, James-workflow. You can see here. We'll see how that works a little bit in more detail. Now, there are a couple of different tabs. The Properties tab is actually the tab that is what we were just in. You can see that it kind of gives us the ability to change the display name, change the URL here. If I do change this after I've published this, then I would have to republish this workflow. So it's kind of important for us to stick to the same URL that we created in the beginning. If you have to change it, you can, but it's not recommended to do so. Simply just create the workflow or create the URL name that you want to represent this workflow. The enrollment process tab is actually where we'll actually start creating the workflow. We'll visibly have a representation of what we're configuring and how we want that user to flow through their user experience. Look and feel, of course, is a tab that we can change the colors, change the layout, change kind of how it looks and how we represent that to that end user. And we'll talk about that in more detail. We have a lab that shows that. And then the snapshots where we actually publish it. This gives us not only a history of what we've published from this specific workflow, but also allows us to publish for the first time this workflow once we've created it. And then we have an advanced tab, and that's where we'll actually see the full URL that we actually send users to. So this is if we have a device that needs to be onboarded, we would put this URL in a controller to redirect users anytime they come into an open SSID or they've logged in for the first time and they need to go through an onboarding experience or onboarding process. This would be the URL that they would be directed to once we've published this workflow. A couple other things I like to point out as well is if I were to create this workflow and I want to remove it completely, we can of course do the cleanup option here, and you see that we can click on this and it would delete the workflow and related data. It's important to understand that this does not remove the information or the servers or any other device configuration that we've configured along the way of creating this workflow, but it just simply deletes the workflow itself. So in this case, we've now created the URL, and now we're going to go in and actually start the workflow. So we're going to click on the enrollment process. We're going to click on Get Started, and it's going to give us some options here. These are all our plugins that we talked about earlier. These are all different options that I can plug into the workflow for that user to experience. In this particular case, we're going to start off with an acceptable use policy, and so it's the first option here, and then we're going to actually push next here. Once we do that, it asks us to either create a new acceptable use policy from a standard template, or we can have some options here. Do understand that if we did have multiple workflows, or if we have different areas within that workflow that we would want to present a acceptable use policy again, we can reuse that. It is independent, and so therefore we can either choose to use that one again, or we could create a unique one for every time we want to do an acceptable use policy. That's totally up to you. We're going to use the new, or the new and standard at this point. And then our display name, we're just going to put in here the James AUP. Also, you can see that there's display information. There's different options that we can choose, even from the standpoint of colors. This is the customization side, look and feel, as we call it. And then, of course, here's where we can actually put in different messages. Okay, so you can configure this or customize this. I'm going to use a standard template to keep it simple, and that will give us the ability just to have something representing an acceptable use policy. I can always go back in this and change this, customize it later as well. So from that standpoint, we're going to save that. And now you can see we have a first step here of an acceptable use policy. Like I said, if I wanted to go in and change this, I could simply click on this display, and of course that would draw me back into that configuration, and I can of course adjust that as I see fit or as needed. I'm going to cancel that. And so we have our first step within the enrollment process, which is the acceptable use policy. All right, now we're not going to stop there. What we're going to do is now we're actually going to create a split. So we talked about the split plugin before, and I'm going to actually apply that to this workflow. So I'm going to click in between step 1 and the results. I'm going to click on that. And then I'm going to go down and look at the options I have. Again, these are plugins. I can use any one of these or the only ones that I want. In this case, I'm going to select the split users into different branches. And so that's going to create the first branch or the first split within our workflow. I'm going to push next. It's going to be a new split. And again, each one of these splits can be independent. I could recreate or I could use an existing one because this is a new Cloupath deployment. There aren't going to be really any other options in there. These are just some presets in there, but I want to use my own and create a custom split. And so I'm going to use a new split here. I'm going to push next. I'm going to name that split. And we're going to do this as Corp BYOD dash, and then we're going to also have a guest user. And this is just naming that split itself, okay? So we can identify that. So at that point, I'm going to push save. And now you see we have our two options here. These are the two that that I can create. I can also create additional options here. And so if I want to do that, I could click on additional option here. But what I want to do at this point is just name these or customize these. So I'm going to click on this one and click on the little pencil here. And it's option 1, and of course this option I'm going to call corporate BYOD. You can have other customized, you can do filtering, we'll talk about that later. Again, it's enabled. We can create display text. You can see there's a bunch of other different configurations. This will actually modify what would be displayed here. So this would, we can go customize that later. But right now, I'm going to just leave it the way it is at default. So now we see that one has been changed to corporate BYOD. I'm going to go click on my second tab here. It's important to understand and note that when I click on a tab, it basically covers up the others, and of course now it's displaying this second option. Each one of these, because these are branches, might have different representations, meaning that I'll have additional steps underneath this tab opposed to the different additional steps I'll have in this different tab. So it's important to click on the tab that you're wanting to configure or to adjust to make sure that you're adding steps or you're creating a workflow based underneath that particular tab or that particular branch within your workflow. So I'm going to click on Edit on this, and this is going to be Guest User. I'm going to push Save to that. And now we see we have two different tabs. These are two different results that I now have in my workflow. Users, whenever they start onboarding, they're going to go first going to see the acceptable use policy. Then they're going to be presented with two different options that they can go, which is going to be corporate BYOD or guest user. Okay, now that I've completed that, I want to start developing these branches. So in this case, we're going to go under the Corporate BYOD tab, as you can see here, and I'm going to click on the Insert Step here. Now, what I want to happen is as soon as that person selects that option, I want them to validate or verify that they are a corporate BYOD or a corporate user. In that case, we're going to try to insert an authentication process. And so what I'm going to do is select the second option here, authenticate to a traditional authentication server. I'm going to push Next. Okay, and so now once I've selected that, you can see I have a couple of different options here. I can connect to LDAP, Radius, the onboard database, a couple of different options there. So what I'm going to do is click the Active Directory, and I'm going to configure that for this example. So my AD domain name, we're going to just put in Ruckus Training. So we're going to put that in there. Again, these are just your configurations based on your settings. And when I mean your settings, I mean your LDAP servers that you have configured. So you'll need to go in there, and this needs to be applied based on those configurations and how it's going to be connecting to it. In this case, you see I've got the LDAP. You might use LDAP S or Secure in your environment. In this just lab, we're just using straight LDAP. And then the AD/DN name, we're going to be adding it in there. And then ultimately, we need to select, in this case, an AD username attribute. And we can choose the attribute, and we're going to use the user principal name in this particular case. Again, though, different servers, each one of these will have custom configurations based on your environment and how you want to configure it, and of course how it's going to match into your existing setup that you have. And that's where Cloupath shines, because it allows us to adapt and to be able to incorporate in many different environments that you already have set up. We're simply trying to automate the process that you possibly are doing manually in your environment when it comes to onboarding devices. So once we've configured that, we're going to go ahead and push Next. And we can look through the different options here. One thing we can pay attention to is to see that you can use CAPTCHA if you want to do that. So in that case, we can select this option and it will verify and add additional parameters or additional features on verifying that particular user. And we are going to go ahead and select that for this, this example. You can see there's some other configurations that we can do. Again, we're just trying to keep this simple as a demonstration. Definitely when you get into yours, you can look at these different options and be able to explain these or customize it to your environment more specifically. But this is just the demo of creating a basic workflow. You do also notice that once we went to the next page here, the demo or the display name already was populated. We're going to just keep that simple. We can customize this, making it more personal or more specific and more descriptive for what we're trying to do. But again, we're just creating the authentication method. So I'm going to go ahead and click Save here. And we can see now we have an additional step here, step 3, underneath corporate BYOD, and that is to prompt the user for credentials, and we're going to be using it against the authentication to the Ruckus Training AD server. Now, because the authentication, when a user or a device is trying to authenticate, is based on certificates, we want to be able to manage those certificates, right? So if it is a case that this user is onboarding a new device, replacing an old one, we would definitely want to have them review the certificates that might be associated or assigned to them, allowing them to delete or deactivate those other certificates that are no longer active simply because we're replacing it. So we're going to add a prompt for that particular feature or that particular option. It's going to ask for concurrent certificates. So as that person authenticates and they move on through that workflow, this is going to cause it to pop up and say, these are the certificates we show issue to you. Are they still active or still needed? If there aren't any that need to be deactivated, that's fine. But also it will give an opportunity for the user to say, oh yeah, there's one that I no longer have that device, or it's not issued to me anymore, and allows them to delete those certificates. This is important from certificate management. If we have those deactivated, then that licensing of that particular certificate can then be reused. So it's a case that this is an important process when it comes to managing these certificates, and again, allowing it to be self-managed from that particular user. That user knows better than anybody else what devices he's currently using, what's active, and of course what he can deactivate that he might not be using any longer. So we're going to push next there. And we're going to be using a new prompt. So this is, again, everything's modular. So in this case, you're going to select a new one because this is a new Cloupath deployment. We don't have any existing. So we're going to click that and push next. And then we're going to be asking to name that. Now this is Lab 6A, so I'll just put in Lab 6A when it comes to the concurrent certificates. We can also see there's different parameters here when it comes to the certificate templates, the display threshold, how many we want to display, maximum allowed certificates, so how many certificates are allowed to a user. All of this can be adjusted. Again, we're going to set these or leave these at the default, but do know these are customizable options that you can choose when it comes to configuring this workflow. So once we've done that, we're going to push save. Oh, sorry, has to be unique. Apparently I've got something in there older, so I'm going to put this as new. Save. So now we can see that we have a new prompt after they've authenticated. They move on through this workflow, and step 4 is going to give them an option to say, I'm going to remove any existing certificates issued and see if there's any that they want to deactivate at that point. Then now that we've gone through this process, we've authenticated the user, we've verified there's any certificates, what we want to do is this device they're onboarding, we now want to assign them a device configuration, and we want to assign them a certificate, and that's the end result it is for each branch. One thing I do like to point out is by default, anytime a option is selected from a split user or the end of each branch, there is this automatic result, because that's really what we want, is a result from this workflow, right? So if I click on guest user, you'll even see there's a result here that was already configured. Now that needs to be configured, but it's in that workflow, all right? So at that point, we can go in and edit this and tell it exactly what kind of device configuration as well as certificate we want to issue to the device of anything that runs through or goes through this particular branch of this workflow. So we're going to finish our corporate BYOD up. So we're going to click on that, scroll down. We're going to go into the result and we're going to configure it. Okay, now that we're doing that, you're going to see we're going to assign this. So the way I'm going to configure this result is I'm going to go over here to the pencil on the far right. We're going to click on that, and it's going to give me the option to choose. So in this case, it says none, do nothing. Of course, we don't want to do that. We want to actually create a new device configuration. So we're going to select this option. We're going to push next. And this is allow us going to be able to configure a device configuration. What is a device configuration? Well, this is identifying the SSIDs that we want this particular device to connect to and authenticate from. So when they connect to that, we'll be able to say this is the settings that we want configured on that particular device. Again, all of this is modular, so it can be a case that I could configure this here and then reuse it in a different branch. Now, depending on those branch results or depending on what you're wanting to accomplish within those branches of the workflow, will cause you to either configure multiple device configuration options or possibly reuse them. Again, it really has to do with what type of device we're onboarding. Naturally, we wouldn't probably want to use the same device configuration for a BYOD corporate device than we would, say, a guest user. So those would be two different configurations. Why would we have two different ones? Well, the BYOD device, we might want it to be able to configure to a secure network that's separate from what we might want guests to connect to. And so therefore we'd have two different device configurations. The guest might go to a VLAN only internet connection and so forth. And so each one of these are customizable and can be applied at the results of each one of these branches, ultimately giving us a unique configuration depending on the device that's being onboarded. So here we're going to just do a new device configuration. We're going to do this as Corp BYOD. And then in the wireless connections here, we're going to configure this. Now, it's very important to understand the SSID that I put in here needs to be the same SSID of the wireless connections that we have on our controllers or on our wireless networks, okay? Because this is literally going to be a configuration that's going to be downloaded on the device, this information needs to be accurate or matching that exactly. So we're going to configure the wireless connection. In this case, I'm just going to say my name, James Secure. And this way, I'm going to have an SSID that's called James Secure. So when this device gets onboarded, it goes through this onboarding process and it gets its configuration downloaded. It's going to know that it needs to go to and be connected to the SSID James-Secure. And of course, then the certificate will be used that we're going to be showing and configuring in a minute is going to be used for authentication for that particular user. So I'm going to push next here. We also have the conflicting SSIDs. Now, a conflicting SSID is going to be the onboarding SSID that this person might be connected to right now, performing his onboarding duties or his onboarding process. So in this case, we're going to be, and again, this is an existing SSID that they actually connected to. And so I want to identify this. So when this device now is onboarded and gets its certificate, I don't want it to be going back to that onboarding open SSID. I want it to go to the secure SSID. And so when we say it's conflicting, we're going to basically verify and say, we do not want you to go back to this. And so we're going to identify it here. And then part of that configuration will cause it to want to go to the secure instead of the existing SSID they're connecting to while onboarding. These are different options when it comes to the OSs. We can specify these when it comes to the type of device and what operating system it's running. In this case, we're going to keep these as default, but again, you can see this is part of the MDM and of course NAC features that we have that we'll be explaining in more detail later. We're going to keep those as default for now. And you see here we have a couple of options when it comes to the authentication. So once that certificate is issued, what device do we want it to authenticate to? In this case, we're going to be using the onboard radius server that Cloupath already has up and running on this particular instance. It always does. So when you install Cloupath, radius server is a feature that is active, ready to go, and gives us the ability to use that. And so we're going to be using this in an example. So we're going to keep it at the default of authenticate to the onboard radius server. We have additional options. Again, more details when it comes to while the device is onboarding. We will verify information there. And again, that's the reason why we say NAC MDM Lite, because it will go and verify this information while that device is being configured for the access from Cloupath. So we're just going to leave that again at default. We're going to push next. And then we're going to issue a certificate. Again, this is the certificate that is actually going to be used for authentication. So once that device migrates to the secure network that we just identified in previous steps, this is actually going to cause it to use this certificate for authentication. So we're going to create a new certificate template. And we're going to be using the onboard certificate authority. Again, this is just an example. You can see there's many other options we can provide within Cloupath, allowing us to use either items or certificate authorities you already have in your existing environment, or allow you to simply use the one that's onboarded, already active and running within Cloupath. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to be using the intermediate CA there. We're going to push next. And then we're going to select a username. Now you can see that there's already presets here. Of course, you can set your custom one, and this is just the authentication name or the setup or the format in which we're going to be having that user authenticate. Some of the benefits to this is as we identify these, or if we specifically identify these based on the workflow that these are being completed, hence in this case it's the BYOD corporate. Whenever we look at the logs within Cloupath, it makes it very handy for us to be able to look at this and identify how that device or what type of certificate or what type of username. So it gives us ideas of what template that this particular user might be using to authenticate that device. And again, it's just more of that log and be able to readily identify these and be able to look through that quickly and see what guests possibly, faculty, whatever it might be that they're authenticating to, and those logs are just much clearer and gives us a better picture of what's going on. Of course, at that point, we can also select different time zones or time length of period that the certificate is going to be active. In this case, because it is a corporate BYOD, we're going to probably keep it at a year here, but we could shorten this, especially if it's a guest coming in and we're going to be issuing a certificate and they're only going to use that for a couple of days. We could shorten that time period to where that certificate would expire, causing that device to have to either re-onboard or they're on their merry way. They're not going to be coming back, and that allows us to free up a certificate that can be issued to future guests that are onboarding at later dates. So we're going to keep that one at 1 year. When you log in yours, you can see that there's many different options again when it comes to how you want to set this certificate template up. But we're going to leave this at default, and of course, grant it for 1 year. Okay, we see now we have a complete result when it comes to our corporate BYOD. We have a step 3 and step 4 we've created, and then the result of them completing those steps within their onboarding process is that they are going to be issued the configuration of corporate BYOD, and then they're going to be issued a certificate that is going to be used to authenticate that has the username at BYOD ruckuswireless.net that you see there. Again, all these are customizable. You can change these up, but in this case, this person completing this workflow, this is their experience. A couple of things you can see that are handy is you can hover over these particular items and they'll give you more details of exactly how this is configured. And if I need to change it, I can simply click on these URLs and they will give me the ability to go customize or change these parameters. So now I'm going to go in and complete the guest user branch. So I'm going to click on the guest user here. As you can see, that has a different branch or different steps here. We haven't created any, so we need to go in and create these steps. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into the guest user and we're going to click in between here and start step here. And in this example, we're going to simply use a voucher system for this particular user. Now, we haven't talked about that completely yet, but just know that this is a way in which we can have a value given to that user, and then that user can use that to onboard their device. And so we're going to click on Authenticate using a voucher from a sponsor. And we'll talk about vouchers in more detail later, but this is just setting up that branch flow for the guest users. We're going to push Next. We're going to label this. So we're going to label this as guest users. And then you can see we can go in there and change formats of that particular value, or that numeric value, or that value that we're giving them. You can specify the length, alphanumeric. We're going to go ahead and make this just numeric. You can see we have options there. The validity period length, of course, we can adjust. And we can also adapt it in the sense of how many times that particular value could be used. In this case, we have it set as a one-time use, but we could put in there multiple depending on your environment. Again, depending on how you want this configured. If you want more control over it, you can set that up as a one-time. Therefore, each time a user wanted to onboard a new device, they would have to get a new voucher. We're going to set everything else, keep everything else at the defaults. However, we're going to scroll down to the sponsorship area, and we're going to set up the LDAP username. So this is just going to be able to identify uniquely how we want those usernames to be. So it could be a case that we have, and this is a pattern, right, that we're setting up. So if you have somebody that's like john.doe@ruckuswireless.net, then that would be a john.doe. So we can go in there and have the asterisk, which means all of them, or we could be more specific and just say that is going to be a certain pattern that we want here. So in this case, we're going to put in john.doe. And then that way we can verify that that is the pattern matching when it comes to the LDAP username. We're going to keep all the other configurations as default. We're going to push Next. And yet you can see once we push Next, it does come up to create a voucher prompt. This is a display name. Again, these are the display common names you'll see within the workflow. I'm going to go ahead and keep this one at default. There are other options you see that we can choose here. Again, we want to keep it simple just for demonstration purposes, so we'll keep these at default values, and then we're going to go ahead and push Save. As we see in the guest user, we now have a new step here. Corporate BYOD has its own steps. In this case, we have unique steps when it comes to the guest user option if somebody so chooses this within the workflow. So to keep it simple, we're just going to have them ask for a voucher. So in that case, the voucher is completed. If they have a voucher number, they put it in, and then the result is we want to do just like we did with BYOD. Is we want to give them a custom configuration as well as a certificate, and issue that certificate for any future logins towards that SSID that we assign them to in the device configuration portion, giving them the authentication method when it comes to that connection. Now, because we are going in and it is a guest user, we can now create a custom device configuration for guest users specifically, meaning that we're going to have them going to a different SSID. We're going to issue them a certificate with a less time or a shorter time than we did with the corporate BYOD and so forth. So we're going to go ahead and adjust this, and we're going to click on the little pencil here. And we're going to use a new device configuration. Do note that we do have the existing configuration if we so chose, but because this is a guest user, we want to create unique values, and so therefore we're going to create yet another device configuration for the guest users. We're going to go ahead and push Next there. We're just going to give it a simple name here, so it's going to be guest users. We're going to push next there. Wireless configuration. So this is going to be the SSID that we want these users to migrate to. So in this case, this one's going to be James-guest. Again, this will be an SSID that has to be configured on a controller and needs to be existing for it to function correctly. We're again going to be using a certificate to authenticate the user. We're going to push next here. We are not going to configure a conflicting SSID because it might be the case that we could have these users actually use that open SSID and we could have them authenticate to that. But again, as you know, we can configure something and not have them go back to any SSIDs or keep them to have any kind of configuration towards existing SSIDs they might be connected to. And as a result, we're just going to go ahead and push next there. I can identify them at this point. We could go back at a later time as usual. This should be familiar. You can see that this is what we had from BYOD earlier. We're going to go ahead and keep these as defaults as well. We're going to push next. And then we're going to authenticate the user to the onboard ready server again. So we're going to push next there. Additional options, again, these are part of the customizable features when it comes to NAC and MDM. We're going to leave those as default right now. And then we're going to issue them a certificate. Now this is the one that we used earlier that we configured for the BYOD, but we want to configure a new one for these guest users, and we want to shorten the time in which that certificate would be valid. So we're going to create a custom certificate template for our guest users. We're going to select that and push next. We are going to be using the onboard certificate authority, which is the same that we had for BYOD, but again, we're going to be able to customize these certificates. We're going to push next here, and this time we're going to select the guest, right? So we're going to have it authenticate with a different type of username, as you see here, giving us the ability to readily identify this user in our logs as the users are onboarding and using this certificate. We're also going to go in and grant the access, and we're going to shorten that. So in this case, instead of having it as a 1 year, we're going to set it up as 3 days. So in this case, 3 days here, so the certificate will be good. After that time period, that particular user or that particular device would have to onboard again. The way we've got this configured is when they have to onboard again, then they would need a new voucher, right? Because that's what gives us the ability to move forward within that workflow. In this particular case, you can configure it in any way you want and customize it to your needs within your environment. Once we've done that, we're going to push next. Takes a little bit to configure this. All right, once that's done, you can now see that we have a different steps when it comes to the guest user. If we click on corporate BYOD, again, we have those flows. So depending on, as the user onboards, depending on which option they choose within that onboarding experience, they're going to have a different user experience or different requirements. This case, they're going to be having the authentication based on their credentials, whereas the guest user is going to require a voucher. Now, once we've got this complete, it's important to understand that this has not gone into effect simply because we're still in an unpublished state. All right. Anytime I were to go in here and change things, those changes are not immediately taking effect. It's a case that I have to go in and actually publish that workflow once those changes are made for it to become active. What does a publishing process do? Well, publishing process actually creates what I have created from a workflow here, and it's created and represented all of this workflow pattern within a URL. We can see the URL for this particular workflow that's going to be where all this configuration is going to be placed. All right. So now we need to publish this workflow for it to become active. The two ways you can do that when it comes to a brand new workflow, we can either click on snapshots and we can see where we can actually push the publish button, or if it's an existing workflow that we're actually upgrading or updating, we'll need to go and click on this little publish button over to the left of it. because once we've published it for the first time, there will no longer be this option within the snapshot tab. So therefore, you'll exclusively use just this publish option on any future. Now, because it's a snapshot tab, meaning that we'll have multiple snapshots and possibly changes that we would have within a workflow available to us to either roll back towards or to be able to use. It's important to understand too, though, that if you go back to a previous snapshot, although that is what's active and that's the experience the users will have based on that one moment that snapshot was taken, but it doesn't mean that it's going to revert your workflow back to its original form based on that snapshot. So if you're wanting to match that snapshot, you would need to go back and change your workflow to match what that snapshot was, and be able to republish that if you're wanting to make some changes. So it's really important to understand that. In this case, we're going to go ahead and push publish in this case. So at that point, we're going to see this going through a process of being able to compile this workflow and then ultimately put it underneath that URL. Right now, it's still working. You can see that we have the little star or the little active icon here. Once that goes green, then that means that workflow can now be used and devices can migrate to that and go through that workflow experience. We see that it's now gone green, and so now we know that that snapshot is ready to go, or that workflow is ready to go. Where do we go to see that workflow? We can go into the Advanced tab here, and now this URL is the representation of that user's workflow. So we're going to go and click on this. So let's go through what the user experience is here. So now we see that we have the acceptable use policy here that we have set up as the first step. Going to push start. We're going to choose BYOD first, or corporate BYOD first here. And we're going to put in a username and password. This username and password I've set up on our AD server. So let's put that in along with our password and the CAPTCHA. We can see they were authenticated, and now they are asked to download a configuration file. This is Express Connect. It allows them to launch this. It will not only configure their device for the appropriate SSIDs it's to connect to, it will also download the certificate and install the certificate in this device, allowing it to authenticate using that certificate moving forward as it migrates to the secure SSID. Now that we've seen the BYOD side of this workflow, let's go to the guest side. So I started it over here, and now we're going to go next to the guest user portion. We're going to put in a voucher number code that I already have. Push continue. And we can see also they receive a download prompt for them to click on this, and it's going to provide configuration for them as well. It's important to understand that each one of these have a different experience, right? Not only is the experience from the flow, but also the configuration that they're going to be receiving along with the certificate. The corporate side, we remember we set up a certificate that has a validity date of a year, whereas the guest is only for 3 days. Not only that, we've also told each one of them to be configured to connect to a different SSID. This one being a guest, whereas the corporate was the secure, or James Secure is what we set it up for. So either one of them can go through this branch or this workflow, pick their specific branch, and as a result have their unique configuration set up on their device and authenticated through a certificate that has a validity date different than the other branches if you so choose. So this completes the Lab 6A. Hope you enjoyed this, and we're looking forward to showing you some other labs. Thank you.